Hi, everybody. My name is Dani Nordin, and I am the author of Drupal for Designers, which is a series from O'Reilly that talks about the experience of creating design for the Drupal platform, and also the experience of theming the Drupal platform. You can actually reach me at DaniGirl, that's DANIGRRL, if you wanted to follow me on Twitter. You can also reach me at Dani@tzk-design.com. My experience is primarily in branding and visual design, and also user experience and strategy for Drupal projects. So my experience kind of runs the gamut, but right now I'm focused much more on user experience strategy and design, which is what I am talking to you about today. Next. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is actually the life cycle of a Drupal project, and this is how I've seen Drupal projects typically play out in the real world. The first three phases, which are the ones that you see on top there, are the ones that I'm going to be discussing in particular today. The first stage is discovery, and this is the piece of the project that happens both before you do the proposal and after the project has been launched. And during this project, you're really understanding the business that you're dealing with and talking to your client about what their goals are, who their users are, and you're mapping out a sense of how this project is going to work. In the user experience and architecture phase, which I call UX and architecture, you're going to start digging deeper into who the users are of your website. You're going to start organizing the content you're going to have to deal with. You're also going to start identifying and prioritizing the features that you're going to end up building. In site prototyping, you're going to start working on the assumptions that you created in the user experience phase, and you're going to start prototyping specific pieces of the website or pieces of functionality that you can then test with users and make sure that your hypotheses are on track. So if we can go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about discovery. The discovery process is what I consider, there are two pieces to the discovery process in my experience. One is what I call pre-proposal discovery. And that's where you're just getting enough information from the client so you can effectively give them a price for the job and you can put together an effective proposal. So for that, you're talking about a base level understanding of your client's competitive landscape, a base understanding of their users, and an understanding of are there any specific functional needs you're going to have to take into account and build for in this process. You're also going to understand what the goal is of this website. If it's a redesign, why are they redesigning it? If it's a new site, why are they building it? What do they expect they're going to gain from this project? And the post-proposal discovery at the beginning of the project clarifies some of the information that you got in the pre-estimate discovery phase and builds on it and then moves into the user architecture phase. Next slide. So in the UX and architecture phase, what you're doing is you're taking that information that you got during the discovery phase and you're building on it. So by this time, you'll have a basic understanding of the general user types that are going to be interacting with this site. In the user experience phase, you're going to be really digging deep and understanding who these users are at a base level, what frustrations they're dealing with, and what is going to make, and you're going to be getting ideas on how you can make those users, the lives of those users easier through your project. You're also going to start mapping out the key tasks that users need to perform, whether it's reading an article or moderating an article, or it's researching a particular topic through the site, or it's just watching a video. You're going to start mapping out the process for each of those tasks and taking that map and looking at how that relates to stuff you have to build for them. You also want to start looking at the content that the current site has. Who's responsible for it? Who creates it? Is there anything that's going to have to be rewritten if it's a redesign? And finally, you're going to come up with a set of assumptions about what's going to work, and then you're going to create standards that are going to guide the development of the rest of the project. And you're going to test those assumptions through some of the techniques that I'm going to be talking about today. Next slide. So before we get into the actual tactical piece, there's a couple of things that I want to address. One is selling user experience to your team, specifically selling user experience design to your team. One of the problems that can sometimes happen in Drupal organizations or in organizations in general is they don't necessarily have a clear understanding of what user experience is. And as a result, they'll either have a very limited view of user experience, or they will believe that user experience isn't important to their success. So one of the things that you can do to combat that is to back up your arguments with actual success stories from organizations similar to the ones that you're working with. This doesn't mean throwing out Apple and talking about how great Apple is at everything. When you want to make that argument, you want to make an argument about a specific thing that was done at an organization that is similar to theirs that has led to increased success. It could be employee satisfaction. It could be increased sales. It could be increased adoption for a particular piece of software. Whatever it is, it has to be relevant to the stakeholders. Everyone knows that Apple products are great. That's not necessarily relevant to somebody. What's relevant to someone is, there's an organization, this competitor over here invested in user experience and they saw adoption increase by 50% or 20% or whatever number that you have to give. Another thing that you can do if you have a team that is very skeptical about UX is to start with a smaller project or a section of the site and show the success of your approach with that specific piece of the site. This is mostly good with very, very large sites that have many different components to them, or with a large organization that runs several microsites. If you can find one small piece that has an impact on the company's bottom line but isn't critical to it, and start using these approaches on that piece and show the success, you'll go a lot further in selling yourself than trying to overhaul a company's culture the minute you walk in the door. You also want to start looking for techniques that work with your team's project style. Are they agile? Do you need to work in sprints? Or is it a waterfall approach where things get sort of thrown over the wall? With Drupal projects, I find that a combination of agile processes and a reasonable amount of planning beforehand that incorporates the UX and incorporates some prototyping is the best approach. But some teams prefer straight agile, some teams prefer straight waterfall. Another important thing to do is to get your major stakeholders on board early. And I'm not just talking about the managers, although managers are important because they can give you advice from the top down. But you also want to talk to your developers and to your lead developers and help them understand what you're doing and how it's going to benefit them in the long run. The best argument that you can use with a developer for any of these UX techniques is to say, look, this is going to save you time in creating production code that you're going to have to strip out the minute we realize it doesn't work. And that's really what many of these techniques, especially prototyping outside of Drupal, can really help you do. The other thing you have to do when you're selling UX to your team is to set reasonable expectations for deadlines, project flow, and what can actually be accomplished. You're not going to revolutionize someone's business overnight, but you are going to make a difference, and you are going to help them make a product that is much better than it would be without really understanding your user. So make sure that you're realistic, that this stuff takes time. It's not necessarily going to be accomplished in a 2-week sprint, but the result of this is often an extreme time savings on the back end of the project when it comes to actually building stuff, because you're not wasting time on production code for a project that's not really going to work. Next slide. So now we're going to start getting into some actual techniques for Drupal projects. Now, many of these are actually traditional UX techniques, that have either been modified to be used with Drupal or that I've used successfully in Drupal projects. Every user experience technique that has ever existed is not going to be covered in this presentation. All of these are techniques that I use every day in my work. Next slide. The first technique, which is kind of a discovery slash user experience technique, is market research. This is where we start getting into metrics and numbers and segments. And if you're working with a larger corporation, oftentimes, or even a mid-sized corporation, you're probably going to have a marketing department that you're dealing with, and they've put together a lot of this knowledge for you. So what you're going to be doing is synthesizing that knowledge that they're giving you into a set of understandings about the user you're dealing with, the competitive landscape of the business stuff that they're dealing with. The key things that you're trying to gauge with market research is who the specific customer segments you're dealing with are, what their basic attributes are, what marketing tactics the company is currently using, what's worked, what hasn't. You're also going to be looking at what makes this company different. What makes clients use this company as opposed to the guy down the street who does the same thing? Right? Next. So from that market research, that's when you start getting into user interviews. Now, user interviews are an interesting thing. What they are is a qualitative approach to understanding user needs. And the important thing to remember about user interviews is that you're not asking users what they want. This isn't about getting together with some potential customers and daydreaming about the future of this company. This is about understanding, for example, how a person who has to deal with this company on a daily basis or has to use this site for a specific task, how they make that decision. How they make that decision to use this company versus that company, and how they move through the task, and what forces are in place that might distract them from the task. So the process that I typically go through for user interviews is, first thing is to define 2 or 3 user types. And these are what you're going to collect from your market research. So they're going to be based on customer segments that you get from the marketing team. But you also want to be aware of any people who have to interact with the site as an editor or an admin. So you also want to make sure that you're talking to, say, the production staff, and you're talking to the marketing staff, and you're not leaving them out of the conversation. So once you've defined your main user types and you've defined a couple of key characteristics of those user types, you want to recruit and aim to interview about 3 to 5 users for each of those types. I try to stick to no more than 5 user types, because otherwise, honestly, anything you deal with will be anything you create will be incredibly clunky, because you're trying to be all things to all people. So try to stick to no more than 3 to 5 user types, and make sure at least one of them is the person who has to deal with entering and moderating content on this website. And that could actually be, in some cases, particularly in publishing, it could be both content editors and moderators and the people who are responsible for entering in the content. So it could be content authors, it could be site admins. Make sure that they are included in your user interviews. The benefit to that is generally with those sort of administrative level tasks, you only have to talk to 1 or 2 people instead of 3 or 4. Now, when you're doing the user interviews, you want to make sure that you develop your questions ahead of time for each type of user. This helps make sure that the interviews are consistent, helps prevent you from going over time and spending a ton of time on the budget talking to users. It also helps make sure that you're asking questions that the client wants to be asked. one of the things that I do is I put together a quick punch list of questions, and I send it to the client, and I iterate with them. And I find out, are there any things that you want to know that you're not getting out of these interview questions? Once we do the interviews, the main thing we're looking for is what things do you have to do that involve this website. So, for example, if I'm working on a project where we're building a way for students to organize their coursework, what I want to know is not what would you like to see in this kind of software. What I want to see is when you get a syllabus, when you get your coursework for the semester, how do you keep that organized for yourself? What are the frustrations that you have with that process that you've developed for yourself? What really works about that process? And so by taking the conversation completely out of the process of the digital forum and into the more general, how do you organize your work, you're able to get much more interesting data that can inform the design process in a much more seamless way. You also want to start looking at what kind of technology they use. Do they do most of their work on a laptop, or do they constantly check their calendar on their computer? Do they read most of their stuff on the subway, or do they wait until they get home? All of these different things help inform the thing that you're designing and help make sure that you're not leaving things out and you're creating something that's really of value to the person. In terms of the timing that you're looking at for each interview, you're really looking at about half an hour for the interview. If you're doing it well, you want to record it so that you can refer back to it later. You also want to leave about half an hour for notes, and once you've completed all your interviews, you want about 2 to 4 hours for ideation and thematic analysis, and that's when you're really exploring the themes that came up and the sort of consistent bits of information that came up among different users. Next slide. So there are 2 ways that user interviews can be organized. The first is the persona, which many of you may already be familiar with. The main use of a persona is to both understand the primary users of your site, but also to prioritize content and functionality needs for that specific user type. And that's the most important, in my mind, the most important use of the persona is to say, look, this fancy thing that the CEO wants to build, that's nice, it's great to have, but, honestly, this particular type of user does not care about that. They care about this other thing. So we need to prioritize that because that is going to help them get their work done, and that's going to help increase their loyalty. So the things that I like to include in the persona are the typical tasks that they have to perform, the content areas that they're going to find most relevant or interesting, the reasons they have for visiting this particular site or using this particular software, any types of messaging priorities that have been put forth by the business in terms of what we want that user to hear. And also, and this is very important, particular pain areas, things in their life that might be coming up that prevent them from doing this work, that prevent them from doing the thing they're there to do. So, for example, a recent project, I had to deal with students who were getting their MBAs through an online course system. And the biggest thing that I found about these students was that many of them also, in addition to going to school, they also worked full-time. They had children. And so they had a very specific chunks of time that they would set aside to do their schoolwork. And what they needed was to very easily be able to access a couple of specific things that they could knock off in, an hour and a half, 2 hours. So a specific reading assignment, a specific task. And they also needed to have a very concise overview of what their things to do were for that week. And this was very different from the system that had been created for these users, which basically assumed that they had infinite time and they could sort through huge amounts of content and context to get to what they needed. So we realized during that user interview process that we needed a system that could actually handle both. It could give you the context when you need it, but really would focus very clearly on giving you a very concise view of what you needed to do and then sending you to another screen where you can actually complete that task. Next slide. Another technique that you can use for putting together ideas and organizing ideas around the user interviews that you've conducted and the user research that you've conducted is the Postup. And the Postup is actually a very simple process of essentially, this is in a notebook, but it can also be done on a wall or on a huge piece of butcher paper that you can then roll up and take with you. The point of the Postup is to very quickly and very efficiently organize thoughts in a big format so you can step back and get a high-level view. So this is excellent, for example, for consolidating findings from user research. You can put quotes on the wall and start looking at common threads and uncovering the themes and the sort of basic components that really need to be in this site in order to make it effective. It's also fantastic for dealing with navigation and user and information architecture. Understanding what sections content needs to go in, that's what this Postup you're looking at here is. It's reimagining a navigation for a site that I'm working on. It's also very good for getting stakeholders involved in the process and getting people to actually walk through the process with you of organizing the site and co-designing the site with you. The biggest problem with Postups, and I use them for almost everything, is that they do unfortunately use a lot of paper. But the efficiency with which you can do them, the way that they really bring a team together around a topic, and the way that they get you out of the computer and into your head and into the world far outweighs the drawbacks. Next slide. Now, if you prefer a digital way of organizing this information, there's also the Mindmap. And the Mindmap is very similar to the Postup in the sense that it allows you to organize your thoughts very efficiently around a particular topic. I use them often for the same things that I use Postups for. The big difference between mind maps and Postups is that mind maps are largely personal. They're mostly for you. A client isn't necessarily going to be able to look at this Postup and look at this mind map and get it. It also generally requires special software to do. I use MindNode for Mac. I've also used MindJet Manager, which is available for both PC and Macintosh. The reason I recommend using that software for it as opposed to something like OmniGraffle or Illustrator is, quite frankly, ease of use. When you're doing any of these types of projects, what you want is to be able to very, very quickly put your thoughts out on a page. You don't want to have to stop to make a new line or select a new tool, and mind mapping software really helps you do that. The big drawback is going to be that it's really not collaborative. It's not something you can show to a stakeholder and explain. It's something that you can use to collect your thoughts and very quickly get things on a page. Next slide. The next technique, and this is, I would say, about as common as personas, is task flows, which are also called user flows. Sometimes they're called user journeys, and everyone formats them differently. This is one of the ways that I can format mine. Sometimes I also do a more simple flow that just sort of shows boxes one after another with little arrows pointing to them. And what the task flow does is explain to a stakeholder or to a developer how a particular user type or a particular task is done. So, for example, you might do a task flow to figure out the decision process from when I'm looking at a product to when I'm making that decision to purchase a product. And then what screens am I going to hit on the way to that journey? What's going to convince me to follow through with the purchase versus what's going to convince me that this isn't something I wanted to do after all? And the best thing about task flows is they really help you frame the design challenge, and they help developers really understand what order things need to go in, and it helps inform the design process and inform the team as a whole. One of the drawbacks to it is it often does require special software, and clients, in terms of management and stakeholders, very often don't get them. Developers, I've found, tend to understand them and tend to find value in them, but I also have found that developers, managers sometimes feel they're a waste of time. I think they're incorrect, but that's an important thing to know. Some of these techniques you're doing mostly for you and for the team. You're not necessarily going to be showing them to people. It's mostly for your own education and your ability to communicate to the people that you're dealing with. Next slide. So now we get into the phase where you're actually starting to map out how things look on a specific screen. And this is where wireframes come in. For wireframes, which are usually very familiar to most project teams, every team I know has done a wireframe, has done layouts. You can do them in Azure, which is what I use. You can also do them in Balsamiq mockups. You can do them in Fireworks, Illustrator. I've seen wireframes in PowerPoint. The point of a wireframe is to establish your content and functional priorities on the page level for a specific page. This is a wireframe that I did for a design sprint for the Workbench module, which is a Drupal module, and I did this at DrupalCon this year. And the big thing that we're pointing out here is what are the different steps involved in this page? What are the different components of this page that are going to have to be built out in the system? And the best thing about wireframes is that the thing that you really want with a wireframe is you want to be able to understand how content and functionality are going to play off of each other. What is the most important element for the user to see? What is the element that really helps this user get their job done? And to be able to annotate that wireframe, to give notes to that wireframe that the developers are going to be able to use to implement the page, and that stakeholders are going to be able to use to understand the page and the interaction that's going to be happening. The biggest drawback to wireframes is that clients can sometimes find them very hard to visualize, since they often don't deal with real content. They often don't exist they don't exist within a specific page flow. You're dealing with an individual page as opposed to looking at how content flows, how content and functionality flows throughout a website. So that's one thing to definitely be aware of when dealing with wireframes. I do try to get real content whenever possible, but obviously it's not always a possibility. Next slide. Now, a step up from wireframes is the digital prototype. And I tend to do my prototyping in Azure RP, which is a fantastic program. It's about $600. It's very easy to get the hang of, and it allows you to create a prototype with functionality in a very quick amount of time. So what's nice about a prototype is that you can get real content in there. You can get an actual sitemap in there so that things flow from page to page. And you can give stakeholders and you can give users a much better sense of the flow of text, the flow of content, and how the user navigates through the site. And I cannot understate the value of that particular ability. Now, the biggest drawbacks to doing a prototype in a program like Azure is that one thing you're not going to get is production-ready code. You're not going to get something from Azure that you can plug into Drupal. You're also intentionally keeping the visuals low-key, which can make it difficult to test color and emotion and some of these other things that are specifically visual design considerations. But at the level of prototyping, one of the things you're really paying attention to most is the content where it needs to be? Is this something that the user can get a handle on and understand how to use? Do they know why they're here on this site? Can they get their way to the content that they need? So again, the drawbacks are really overshadowed by the benefits of prototyping, and one of the key of prototyping in this way, and one of the key benefits is that you're able to get it done much, much more quickly than you would if you went straight into Drupal. And you also are able to clear up a lot of the questions that you have about functionality and content and relevance to a user before you start spending a whole bunch of time building something in code or building something in Drupal. So we're going to talk a little bit more now about prototyping. Next slide. And next slide. And as I mentioned before, there are two approaches generally to prototyping for Drupal projects. One approach is to jump straight into Drupal, and this can have its benefits. This can absolutely have its benefits, especially in the ability to get the architecture for your Drupal site started quickly and to get started actually laying in the content that's going to make up the bulk of what gets displayed in this Drupal site and what gets put into this Drupal site. And you can see how it works in the sort of real world of Drupal. Now, there's the other approach is to prototype directly in Azure or a similar program in order to get your hypotheses onto a page quickly so they can be tested and you can learn from them. Now, we'll talk a little bit in a moment about when you want to use one or another, but the big difference between these two approaches is that prototyping in Drupal is a time investment. It is a very significant time investment. And as anyone who's worked in Drupal for more than a couple of months knows, there are a million different ways to accomplish the same goal. So what I find about working in Drupal is that when you have a very clear sense of what your goals are and what it is you're trying to accomplish, go ahead, go straight into Drupal. And I also recommend to go straight into Drupal for certain aspects of the project while you're working out complex functionality in Azure or another program, because that will allow you to move the project along quickly without sacrificing that user-centered approach that you're trying to meet, and without sticking yourself into putting a ton of development time and a ton of development hours into a project that's just going to be scrapped the minute a stakeholder looks at it. So next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit, and this will be the last thing we talk about when to prototype in Azure or a similar program versus when to prototype in Drupal. So one of the times that you definitely want to prototype in Azure is when you're dealing with any functionality that is complex and time-consuming to build in Drupal. So, for example, one of the projects I was working on involved a ton of different content relationships, 5 different content types, all of which related to each other in these very specific ways. And all we wanted was to put together something that we could test out with real users and see how they liked it. We wanted to be able to build something that we could get in front of people. And I had started putting together this prototype in Drupal Commons, which is the software we were using, that created all of those content types, all of those relationships, all of those different content formats. And by the end of 30 to 35 hours, I had prototyped a third of the recommendations that I was making in terms of what the system needed. 30 to 35 hours, and the budget was being swallowed up by this development time, and we still hadn't tested this with users yet. I switched to Azure and was able to complete an entire working prototype with all of the different considerations and with annotations that could be exported into a set of functional specs for the team in 4 hours on a plane ride. This is why you want to save some of this stuff for a prototyping tool like Azure, because if you don't know yet that this is the direction you're going to go in, you want to make sure that you're not spending a ton of time on production code and putting stuff into a database that's just going to get replaced or redone. You also want to use Azure or a similar prototyping tool when the development on this site is going to be done by other people on the team or by another vendor. So if you're not the one doing the actual building and the development, don't try to build in Drupal. Build it in something like Azure and give it to them with annotations as a functional spec. You can even help them put together a project plan. And the other time to prototype in Azure is when you haven't actually defined your functionality yet and you haven't defined the development tasks. So this is when you're in that really early UX and ideation phase where you're really just sort of figuring out what's going to work and you're really sort of testing things. That's when you want to use Azure. You don't want to start that in Drupal because it's just going to take up a lot of your time just getting something that's workable. Next slide. So lastly, we're going to talk about when you want to actually prototype in Drupal. One of the times you want to prototype in Drupal, and I do actually recommend starting to get the basic structure of your site, so the different modules that you're always going to use, the different content types you're going to use into Drupal while you're doing the prototyping in another system. So that way you're not losing time in the development phase. But one of the times you definitely want to prototype in Drupal is when you have a very large amount of content to migrate into Drupal. So one of the projects I'm working on now, I'm doing both Azure and Drupal prototyping. And part of that is that we have a huge amount of content, something like 60,000 nodes, that we are moving from a Drupal 6 database into a new Drupal 7 site. So we're starting from scratch in a lot of ways, and part of that process is creating the new content types in Drupal 7 and getting them ready for the development team to port them over and do some of the other work that they're going to be doing on the site. And that is a good opportunity for you to start going directly into Drupal. Another opportunity is when you have complex content relationships involved and you have to figure out how those relationships map to each other. So for example, if you have a week, if you're building a calendar application, for example, and you have a week and you have a day associated with that week, and each of those situations and a task associated with those specific days, and each of those content types, each of those things is a different content type that needs to relate back to the task, needs to relate to the day needs to relate to the week. This is something you want to start figuring out in Drupal, just to figure out how Drupal actually handles this kind of stuff. Another reason to go straight into Drupal, or another opportunity to go straight into Drupal, is frankly if you've got stuff to build that's already been defined. If you already know that you're going to have an event section, and you know what that event section is going to look like, go ahead and build that in Drupal. But if you have other pieces, other things that are going to go into that process that maybe require a little more figuring out, that's when you start looking at what can I prototype in another program that's going to take me less time so I can get this in front of users, learn what I need to, and make sure I'm not spending a bunch of time doing stuff in Drupal that I'm going to end up having to redo down the line. So next slide. So that is an overview of some of the various UX techniques I've used in Drupal. You'll notice that I haven't really talked about user testing as much because that is certainly something that happens and is relevant to Drupal projects, but I wanted to focus this really about UX strategy and some of that front-end stuff that you have to deal with when you're planning and you're designing a Drupal project. So I'm ready. Any questions that you have, feel free to put them in the Q&A.
Thank you, Dani, for a great webcast. Folks, you heard Dani. She's ready to take your questions. If you can open your group chat widget, type them in, send them in. She'll answer them while we have her with us. Looks like we have one question that came in earlier on. Are you able to see that, Dani?
Yes, I can see it. It says, all right, so Anthony asks, can you talk a little bit about working with offshore teams and how the interview/design process can be translated in easy-to-understand terms? That's a fascinating question. I don't know that there's an easy way to do it. One of the things that I have been experimenting with is what I call remote approaches. So, for example, sometimes I will be looking for people with who meet certain criteria for a user interview, and I will, instead of talking to the client about the getting the client's help in recruiting users for interviews, I'll actually reach out to my Twitter feed, and that's nice for getting a variety of different viewpoints. In terms of communicating with offshore teams, a lot of your communication is really going to come down to, are there any language barriers that you need to deal with? And is there an opportunity for FaceTime, even if it's on Skype? So a lot of the techniques that we're talking about here really depend on how you communicate with the team and what are the means of communication. So, for example, I work with remote teams, so they aren't necessarily offshore teams, but the team I'm working with on my current project, one of my collaborators is in Germany, another one is in Natick, very close to where I am, but we still don't have a ton of FaceTime because we're all working from home. And in that case, what we're doing is we're communicating through Basecamp, and I'm actually communicating with the clients through Basecamp, and I'm able to upload the flows and the images and talk to them that way. I can also do screen sharing on Skype and communicate with them that way. But in terms of how to deal with a language barrier between you and the offshore team, that I think is a much harder question to deal with than just how do you sort of organize these different approaches. I think the biggest challenge in working with remote teams is in situations like the Postup, where you're trying to put a bunch of different ideas together on a page and have people actually interact with it. And there are some different applications out there. For example, there is a service called Optimal Workshop that has a subsection called Optimal Card Sorting that allows you to do something that's similar to a Postup in the sense that you can put ideas on the page and you can move them around, but it's really, really meant for information architecture. And the big problem I've seen with using that software is it's hard to get a rationale for how a user is organizing specific information. And you also really have to put all of the information in there up front. And that I found to be problematic. I haven't found a really good answer for those kinds of sort of co-designing events yet. I will also say another really good collaboration tool for content specifically is a site I started using called Gather Content, which is actually much nicer than Optimal Sort in the sense that it allows everyone on the team to see the content, to edit the content, and to move things around in the way they see fit in a way that is separate from Drupal, so you don't have people mucking around in your Drupal database on the client side. You can really settle a lot of those sort of content issues in Gather Content, make notes and comments on the content, and settle all of those issues before you start putting into Drupal. So that service I highly recommend, and I'm using it right now with a team that's largely remote, and I haven't had a single problem with it so far. So that might be a way to deal with that aspect of it. Some of the other stuff in terms of the user types, the personas, a lot of that is going to be the same that you'd have with anything, which is figuring out how to communicate your process to the team. So any other questions?
We do actually. We have a couple more that just came in. If you can click the refresh button, you should. They should refresh.
I just saw it.
And Anthony says a big thank you to you for such a great response. He says it really puts a new perspective on how you can look at things. Thank you, Anthony. Okay, back to you, Dani.
All right. Okay, so Keith says, how has working with Drupal changed your process? It seems like most of the techniques you described are not Drupal specific and apply more to the general UX process. Yes. So that is actually one of the things I said up front. Many of the techniques are actually traditional UX techniques. The biggest change that's specific to Drupal is really the entities you're going to be dealing with. So the biggest thing that I've noticed in working with Drupal, for example, is when you're doing a wireframe, you have this understanding of what's coming from a view versus what's coming from a block. You have this intuitive understanding when you work with Drupal long enough of how the underlying architecture works, and that tends to inform many of the design deliverables in a very positive way, I find. The other thing that's specific to Drupal is that the language you use with your team members in terms of communicating this process changes when you're working with Drupal. You end up working with much more Drupal-specific language. So that's really the biggest thing. In terms of how Drupal has changed my design process, the biggest change I saw when I started working with Drupal is I became less of a visual designer and a brand designer and much more of an interaction designer and someone who really had to think of the content and the flow and how someone was going to actually be moving through this website as opposed to just putting together something in WordPress really quickly or putting together something in straight HTML where it was generally fairly simple and you create a project template and then sort of cut and paste some content into it. Drupal doesn't really let you do that ever. And so it really deepened my design process. So I hope that answers the question. And actually I think I also just answered Gianna Clark's question, which is what about your UX process is unique to Drupal and not to another CMS system or a hard-coded site? So yeah, so it's basically the same thing I just said. This is a really good one. How do you deal with Drupal modules that address the interaction you need but contain usability issues? This is such a good question. Can I say I throw something across the room? Probably not, right? That's not a good answer. The biggest thing I do in that situation, this is actually one of the very key benefits of going straight to Azure before you go into Drupal, because it helps you understand what it is you're trying to build, understand the interaction that you're trying to design, and what's going to work best there without the overhead that Drupal can sometimes give you in terms of this is just the way that something works. And I find this most important with working in, for example, very content-heavy sites where you have certain modules that you're using to make this interaction happen, but those modules are extremely buggy or have serious usability issues. Sometimes what I'll do is have work with a developer on this is what the interaction should be do we want to make this happen with this particular module that performs the same function, or do we want to develop something? Do we want to develop something of our own, or do we want to create a patch to this module to fix some of these usability issues? These are all conversations. If you have a really good developer on the team, these are all conversations that you can have with them, and you can talk through the options. The one thing that you should always be aware of is somebody who says, well, why don't we just use module X? Module X takes care of this. And you can just plug it in and turn it on, and there you go. And that's actually where having some documentation ahead of time is really good, because then you can show somebody, well, this is what happens when they look at this when someone tries to use this thing. These are the problems that they run into, and we need to make sure that those things don't happen, because otherwise we destroy our business goals. So let me see. All right, and I think that might be all of the questions.
I'm not seeing any additional questions either, Dani. Did you have any information additionally to leave our audience with today? Nothing much. If you are interested in checking out a little more of my work, you can check out my website at tzk-design.com. You're also welcome to email me or follow me on Twitter. I know that many of you may have already bought one of the Drupal for Designers guides, but in case you were thinking about buying another book, the Drupal for Designers, the print book, which actually combines the 3 different Drupal for Designers guides in a much more logical format, much more logical flow, with some new content and some additional examples, is going on the market, I believe, in August or September. So if you were interested in picking up another book on Drupal, that one is going to be available soon. And you can pre-order it. It should actually, there's a link from DrupalDesignersBook.com, which is the website for the book. And you can go there and pre-order it from O'Reilly. And thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a great day. Dani, thank you for such an outstanding webcast today, for sharing all your knowledge and expertise with us. Folks that attended the event, we thank you for attending and hope you benefited. We also thank those of you that sent in your questions, because having those questions just adds so much more to our events. Dani's book, Drupal Development Tricks, is the O'Reilly deal of the day, and that means you can get it at a really good price today for attending the webcast. Please visit O'Reilly.com. Look right there. You can't miss it. It's right there. If you like what you heard today, you want to get the book, there's a lot more information there, more for sure than 1 hour webcast can accommodate. Again, thank you, Dani. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude today's webcast. Goodbye, everybody.